If I could dispel one myth in the world, it would be that there is some sort of nobility in suffering. And let me tell you why. This comment came up under the video that I made about the Irish potato famine, which is called the Great Hunger in Ireland because it wasn't actually a famine. There was plenty of food on the island had the British been willing to give it to the Irish, which they were not. And I don't want to speak specifically to the role that the Irish immigrants in America played in perpetuating the oppression of other marginalized groups and in perpetuating systemic racism. They had a role. And I'm happy to address that in greater depth in a future video. But what I wanted to talk about in the video today is the idea that suffering somehow automatically grants you empathy. We cling to this idea in spite of all evidence to the contrary, and I want to talk about it. This is a very Christian idea. This is a very old idea. This is the idea that whatever sufferings you have in this life are going to lead to your reward in the next life. That these sufferings are a beautification of your soul so that when you reach the next life, you will ascend to the kingdom of heaven. That's where this idea comes from. I think at best it's really harmful, it's overused, and it just doesn't match with reality. In the secular world, this might look like phrases like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or this idea that suffering builds character, right? What does that even mean, builds character? And in the Protestant world, maybe this would look like saying things like, God gives his hardest battles to his strongest soldiers, kind of a thing. It's this idea that somehow there is good to be found in suffering, that there is nobility to be found in suffering. And this is just objectively not true. Anyone who has met a person who has gone through enormous suffering knows that that might grant them empathy, and it might not. Often, it does not. I think of the example of FDR. He was a wealthy Anglo-Saxon white dude who grew up one of the blue blood families on the East Coast of the United States. This is the closest that Americans get to a noble class. He was a member of that class. And he got married to a fantastic woman, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. They had a number of children. He began to pursue a career in politics. Had he simply gone into politics as a healthy, able-bodied man, he would not in any way be the FDR that we know today. But he contracted polio, and he became very, very ill, and he never fully recovered. As I think most people know, he was effectively paralyzed from the waist down and was also in a great deal of pain. And he actively suffered physically a great deal for the rest of his life. And that taught him empathy for the suffering of the everyday human. And we take this story as inspirational, right? Because this wealthy patrician man was able to learn empathy through his own suffering. But he wasn't able to learn empathy through his wife's experiences which I'm sure she told him about because she was Eleanor Roosevelt. He wasn't able to learn empathy through his children. That didn't do it. He wasn't able to learn empathy just by hearing the stories of people in the world. That should be enough. That should be enough. But no, he had to be in immense and debilitating pain for the rest of his life in order to learn empathy. And even then, it was lucky that he learned empathy. So when a population, when a people go through what the Irish went through during the potato famine, you really want there to be some good that comes out of it. You want the people who went through that to have come out of it with some empathy. And I have no doubt that some people did. But the reality is that extreme trauma causes a lot of different reactions in human beings, and not all or even most of those reactions are empathy. A lot of those reactions are self-hatred. Some of those reactions are a dark nihilism. Some of those reactions are to mimic the characteristics of the people who brutalized them in order to no longer be brutalized. All of these reactions, by the way, are freaking understandable. They're understandable. They're human. So the people that this commenter is talking about are people who were deeply, deeply traumatized, and their reaction to that was to brutalize rather than be brutalized themselves. That wasn't the morally right thing to do, but that is what some people will do when they come out of trauma. And I want us to be very, very clear as well that I think in the human animal, there's merely present in a lot of us humans the impulse to brutalize. If that impulse is encouraged or not actively discouraged, then there are some percentage of the population who are going to brutalize. Like that is, it's within us. It's something that can happen, even without trauma, even with just like a happy home, with a happy home and reasonably kind parents and reasonably prosperous circumstances. Some people will just brutalize, and I'm not even talking about people who are like toxic narcissists or who are psychopaths. I'm talking about like regular ass people who, if they aren't given enough disincentives, will just brutalize. So I think we really need to understand within ourselves that sometimes from suffering comes more suffering. From suffering that has been caused to us, we can cause more suffering to other people unless we recognize and check those impulses within ourselves. The impulse towards nihilism, the impulse towards mimicking our brutalizers, the impulse towards dehumanizing people who have not suffered in the exact same way that we have suffered, or people who are not members of our tribe. I think we need to be really, 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 really careful when we have these conversations to focus on the stories and the systems of oppression that are present in those stories, to honor the story. I honor the story of the Irish potato famine. I hear that story and I am very, very, very emotionally moved by it, and I'm devastated that that happened to any group of people. But I do not assume that coming out of that they're somehow going to become something other than human.